Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. When we first heard that, Dr. Buccieri and I thought it was an announcement of his upcoming presentation. But I guess we'll settle for the school fight song. I'm Chad Stebbins from the Institute of International Studies. Thank you for coming this morning for this presentation on the Celtic Tiger, Ireland's economic miracle. Our presenter this morning is Dr. Dominic Buccieri, an assistant professor here in the Plaster School of Business. He specializes in marketing and international business. Also is a frequent leader of study abroad trips, particularly to Europe. I had the pleasure of accompanying him on a study abroad trip to the Czech Republic and Austria last December with 20 students. And he does a great job of keeping his calm in the face of impending disaster and never panics, always smiles. So thank you, Dr. Buccieri, for presenting today. And he's going to be leading a study abroad trip to Ireland this coming May. So I think he'll mention that toward the end of his presentation. So please give it up for Dr. Dom Buccieri.
Thank you, Dr. Stebbins. And as our trip, my responsibility in the Czech Republic was counting the heads. So Dr. Stebbins got to have the fun, and I had to make sure we had 20 heads on the bus at the end of every session there. So, but welcome to this chat here. Let me see if this works. Am I on? There we go. Was I hitting the wrong button? There we go. All right, so the Celtic Tiger, that's what we'll be talking about today. Oh, and a brief housekeeping for my marketing research students. Our sign-up sheet's right here. If you haven't seen me, feel free to stop by at the end to get your credit there. But the Celtic Tiger, right, and let's not confuse that with the Celtic, right, for any of us NBA basketball fans, but that's what we're going to be looking at here. So. Again, as Dr. Stebbins said, my name is Dr. Buccieri. I teach here in the area of marketing and international business, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you about this topic. So the way we'll approach this here is that we'll talk about kind of how this Celtic Tiger came to be, kind of the economic miracle that is Ireland, but then hopefully before you all start to get into your nice comfortable naps, I will then bring it back to some content that's hopefully relevant within your business education here, to make this hopefully kind of click here with some of the things that we're learning in our program. All right. So first, so obviously this is about the Irish economy, right? The economy of Ireland here, and there is this. It was kind of framed the rise and the fall of the Celtic Tiger, but then kind of reemergence here. So what I thought I'd start with here, just to try and set the stage, is this is just kind of a chart of the gross national income per capita over a period from 1970s to about 2022. And all I want to really kind of point out here is that you can see, back at the early point there, this is Ireland compared to other European countries. And I didn't put all the others in there, not really important, but you can see that they're really ranked towards the bottom there, right, of the group there. And they had that similar trend. And then in this period, right, where the economy starts to heat up, you can see they start to kind of overpass many other economies. And if you kind of look where they are today, it's one of the more wealthy economies, right? So that's really kind of what this story broadly is kind of about. Just wanted to set that stage, all right? Okay, but before we get into more present day, let's talk briefly about the history. Now, I am neither a historian nor am I a sociologist, or even really an economist, for that matter. I am more of a business kind of academic and scholar, and a practitioner. I got you. No worries. So I tend to look at these things more from how businesses form strategy based on the macro kind of environmental factors, right? That we have to operate within. So I just want to preface that. So before we get into historically, 1922. Actually, it's December 6th, 1921 is when Ireland gained its independence from the United Kingdom. Okay, and that was in part other factors, but some of the autonomy that they were looking for and the promise, the idea of greater economic development, economic growth. Because from the, up to this point, 17, 1800s, there was mass emigration. Folks from Ireland leaving, coming to the New World, other places, for more economic prosperity, as well as some religious freedoms, things of that nature as well there. But obviously economic was kind of at play there, right? So Ireland is suffering economically, so they gained that independence in 1922. And then from that period, from 1922 to the 1970s, they never really did realize that economic development or growth that they were hoping for. Largely, it was an economy based on agriculture in nature there, not a lot of high value added work, if you will, and it was very reliant upon the UK. That was pretty much their main trading partner. So they never really experienced that economic success that they had hoped for. All right. So then in 1973, now this is not necessarily what triggered, but this would become an instrumental move, so to speak, in where the economy would end up 20 years later and into today, is they joined the European Economic Community, which eventually would be absorbed into what we now know as the European Union. Okay, and hopefully we all remember that from our coursework, right? That is that was the move in Europe there to kind of create a more singular kind of marketplace, right? Economic, politically, right? Joining forces there to kind of create a kind of economic superpower, so to speak, to rival that of the U.S. So that's happening there, right? And we got a nice little thing, here, shortly available, underdeveloped country, right? Unrivaled opportunities, right? And that's the thing, though, is that really this is kind of a story of one time Ireland was a underdeveloped economy, right? If you go there today, look at it today, that's not what it was at that point. Okay, so this is step one in kind of the process here. All right, so now, and when we look at this rise of the Celtic Tiger, that's how it's referred to. You can kind of think of it as some have kind of called it, three different periods or three Celtic Tigers. You got a period from 1987 to 94, then 1994 to about 2000, and then 2000 to 2008. And we'll briefly look at each of those periods, what kind of happened there, and how this process took off for them. And then, of course, there's the fall, which is a time period that we probably are familiar with in recent history, and then kind of where they're going. So we're going to kind of walk through a timeline of what happened and some of the steps that the country took to get there. Okay, so during this first period, we call it the first Celtic Tiger. This was really about the country now developing more, we call it macroeconomic stabilization, right? Think about your macroeconomic environmental factors there. So you have economic policy, fiscal policy, and industrial policy. These are some of the things that we've probably discussed, if we recall, in our economics coursework. So on the economic policy side, okay, so you had a government that was really, at that point, nationalistic in its kind of viewpoints. It was overly involved kind of in the economic scene of the country there. So at this time, and really they were leading up to this from the 1970s as they joined what would become the EU there, is starting to then create more competition, more deregulation, right? Having the government be less involved, right? And this, in some European scholars might call this economic liberalism, right? Whereas on this side of the pond, we might refer to it more as capitalism. There are some differences in the two, but largely there's a lot of similarities there, right? Where it's really about the pursuit of individual, right, interests, because if we do so, then and you have the government that stays out of industry and fosters competition, then therefore individually we are obviously having to satisfy customer needs, and therefore better products, more competition, better price, all those things, and that makes the economy overall better, stronger, right? That's the basic idea there, right? So deregulation, privatizing of industries, key industries previously had some government ownership in there, state ownership, things that we talk about, some of our courses there. So competition and deregulation were things that they were setting, they were getting those things in order there for what they wanted to do in the future there. And then on a fiscal policy, wage determination, there was a concerted effort to kind of hold wages, if you will, public-private partnership to kind of keep wages at a point there, try and stem inflation, right? And think about where we are today, right? because that would become important when you think about wage rates and in terms of being a competitive marketplace for additional business, right? To have a favorable environment to do business. And then that leads into kind of industrial policy, right? Now, it's also tied to fiscal too, the tax rates. So that number, 50%, right? That's, if any of you finance students have looked at, corporate tax rates, that's a pretty significant number, right? So this was not overnight. This was over a series of stages. The country got down to 12.5% corporate tax rate. That's a pretty significant drop. And they would be pretty much the second lowest tax rate in Europe. And that's important to to kind of recognize there, right? So what they're doing is they're creating this environment that would be conducive to business, business friendly, pro-business environment, right? You've got the kind of the capitalistic trends there with the competition, the deregulation. You've got an emphasis on keeping wages in check. You're lowering corporate tax rates, right? Now, this tax rate was no small thing. This was a pretty significant issue in Europe because most countries there have higher tax rates, or at least they did, okay? And then in addition, what's going on there is they've got some of these different governmental entities. So you have the Industrial Development Agency there, and their function was really on industrial policy was to attract what we call inward foreign direct investment, foreign companies that want to do business. So you think back to the last slide there, that the macro environmental factors that they're setting up there. Now you've got this agency, and they're starting to attract some well-known companies. These are just a couple, not an exhaustive list, right? Dell, Intel, Microsoft there. And then you've got this Enterprise Ireland, and what they create there is you can't really see this too well, the IFSC, International Financial Services Center. And that's right there, when that was created, that brought about 14,000 high value added jobs to Ireland right there. So you're starting to create these underlying, right, kind of institutional factors to then really give yourselves a potentially strong economy, right? Again, so that's what we call this period macroeconomic stabilization. Okay, and then another piece there, because you need to have more than just the policy there, is the workforce. So at the outset of this Celtic Tiger period in the 80s there, they had an employment rate. I'll not go with unemployment that we typically talk about. Some will say that employment rate is good to look at, but there was an employment rate of about 60% in the country of Ireland, which was at the very bottom of the European market, European countries there. So pretty significant population not in the workforce, which was really contributing towards this underdeveloped economy that was not experiencing that economic vitality, right? High cost of living, things of those nature there. So they would have this Science Foundation Ireland, and this was created by the government to start trying to look at ways to incorporate more STEM, right? Science, tech, engineering, math, into the workforce there, because they're seeing this high tech, from the IDA, bringing in some of these tech companies there and saying, okay, these are some of the skill sets we need. And so then that led to some of the well-known programs that you have now with those universities there having these types of programs. And also, they brought women into the workforce. There was a large portion of really kind of married women that have been left out of the workforce that Ireland said, we've got a strong potential here, right? Get educated, and then now you have a much bigger, stronger workforce. So these are some of these underlying and these macroeconomic factors that the country is working on to then get us to this period, right? So now in this period from 87 to 94, they are seeing some good economic growth, right? If you think back to that original chart that I showed you there, that line was trending upward. They did add, their economy nearly doubled, during that period of time. So they were starting from a very low point. So even though the overall number may not look great, they did about double during that period of time, during this first Celtic Tiger stage, okay? And then we get into the next stage. And really this stage was just a stage of rapid growth is how we look at it. I just put some slides up here with some different companies there. They attract a lot more companies there. And there's really two primary sectors that they really kind of built this foreign direct investment on, right? And this was really the impetus of their strategy, right? It was we're going to create foreign direct investment inward foreign direct investment, where other countries, their companies are coming here. We're going to have trade policies, right, that are conducive to strong exports, things of that nature, right? Global economy, that's really where the country is heading because it's an island nation and a rather small nation at that, right? So two significant areas in the area of tech is you have, of course, your general high-tech technology that we think of, but also pharmaceuticals. And when you look at high technology sectors, pharmaceuticals falls in there. I do some research in other emerging markets, and pharmaceuticals, they get lumped right in there with all of your IT and those other tech markets. So you may not think about it as tech, but when you think about it, pharmaceuticals is high tech. So, and most of these companies, as you see on this list here, this is not an exhaustive list, mostly US, right? There are a few European companies with Adnagen and Bayer, right? Those are German companies. GlaxoSmithKline is a company out of UK. Those are your pharmaceutical, and those are more of your traditional tech companies that we think of there. But they're seeing just rapid growth during this period of time. Everything is looking great. The economy, again, think about that trend line that I showed you, is just booming, right? However, like any story of any kind of developing country that is looking to move into this what we call developed market, there still are some underlying factors that maybe are not quite evolved yet. And we'll talk about that towards the end as well, and some stories of today there, right? So a couple things going on there, right? First off, as you saw from that last slide, Ireland, right, they were very US-centric in terms of who they were attracting from foreign direct investment. At one point, 14 of the 20 largest companies in the country were US companies, right? And about 15% of the total workforce was of US multinational corporations. So you think about that, 15%, right, of your total workforce, is coming from US multi. So you're very reliant upon a singular market, right? And we'll see in a moment where some of the challenges of that comes from, right? So that's one key factor there. Also, I'll come back to the first one in a minute there, but the GDP sort as compared to GNI, right? So if we remember, right, GDP, that's the total output of kind of a country, right? But GNI, but that can include foreign, right? FDI that we talk about there, whereas GNI is really the gross national income, and that's really the total income created by the people of the country, so to speak, right? Home or abroad, right? So those two numbers can be different. So the GDP was kind of outpacing GNI. So what I mean by that is that the total output looked great, but obviously quite a bit of that was really driven by foreign companies. Now let's not diminish where the GNI went to. It was definitely becoming a country with much higher living standards. But just goes to show that there were some still things that they had to work on. So what was happening there was they weren't necessarily creating their own kind of demand, their own innovation yet. And that's one thing that Ireland was kind of lacking at that point, was although they were kind of becoming this tech market, they lacked that national innovation system that countries like the US and other developed markets had. And that's a key point there, because again, you're very reliant upon other countries, right? Specifically the US in this case. Also, you've got the property sector beginning to heat up, which I think we all know kind of what happened. We'll talk about that in a moment, kind of what happened in this country in the a few years after this point there. And then because of this boom economy that Ireland is experiencing, right, and they continue to try and reduce tax rates in various ways, trying to promote this pro-business environment there, there was some declining efforts in terms of some of the welfare support, welfare effort, right, going on within the country there. And then probably more importantly was a continued weakening regulation of financial sectors. And we saw some of this globally, but of course it's going to hurt Ireland as well. So these are some of the factors kind of going on in the midst of this boom economy. Okay? So the third stage of this, and this is really kind of where it starts to get more interesting, is this is referred to as the bubble economy, right? The third stage of the Celtic Tiger. All right. So here in the US, we have the dot-com burst, right? And for those of you that may not recall that, maybe too young, the internet businesses, the online businesses exploded in the 1990s, and really many of them ever failed to produce any profits. Some of them never even delivered products, right? It was really all based on a business plan. Companies were raising significant venture capital, significant capital in the initial public offerings markets there, all based on ideas, right? And stock markets, kind of was I mean, if you're investing in those stocks at that time, you're doing very well. However, that bubble would burst because a lot of those companies, as I said, fail to register profits. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, now you have an economy that is becoming really dependent upon the U.S. tech market, right? And therefore, they feel that reverberation. So there was definitely a hit to the U.S. economy during the dot-com bubble burst, and that reverberation was felt in Ireland to some degree there as well, right? But they would bounce back from that, and they would be okay with. But that's still that hit there, right? And also another key thing here. This is a key piece that when we get to the fall in just a moment there is they're in the European Union, but in 2001, Ireland adopts the euro. And this does pose some challenges for them in what would come, okay? So now you got cheap credit, right? Because as you're now being integrated into the global financial system, right? You're part of the euro now, and of course the euro is the currency of the European Union, right? And so hopefully we all recall this, is that not every country in the EU automatically adopts the euro, right? It's called the Eurozone, and in time you're supposed to adopt the euro, but of course there's the convergence criteria, the Maastricht criteria, the 4 different points. I won't go into those. Kind of gets to your GDP to debt ratios, things of that nature there, that a country has to achieve there to have that economic stability to be able to then play in the same market, right, financially, with the other more stronger European markets there. So the credit expands cheaply, right? And they're starting to get some wage pressures, upward pressure, because you have an economy that's now experienced a pretty significant period of prominence, right? So wages start to press up a little bit there. And of course, companies that are investing there, and think back at originally, low wage rates were actually one of the factors there, right? So you had the low tax rates, you had the low wages, you had all those different factors, right, that were conducive to business there. And now the domestic demand is starting to drive the economy as well. That's the property market I was talking about heating up there. You're having a lot of personal consumption, personal spending, which is good. It's great for an economy there. But so some of the dynamics of their economy is changing a little bit as well. Okay? And you're seeing a little bit, not a ton, but a little bit of the IT, right, the technology manufacturing heading east. And not necessarily, in today's, we think about heading east to China perhaps, but more to some of the Eastern European, Central European countries, because you're coming out of a post-Soviet kind of socialist regime there, and those countries are starting to, and there's some markets there, Poland, Czech Republic, some of those that are seeing some growth kind of in tech there. So you're seeing a few companies shifting there, not a lot there, but you got some different factors going on there, okay? And it's all kind of setting up, the country for basically kind of a letdown, right? Kind of a fail there. So these are the factors kind of going on there, all right? And I'll say, and with the dot-com burst, right, just to take a quick kind of side step here, that event right there actually really reshaped how we actually approach entrepreneurship, innovation, kind of in this country in terms of how we evaluate firms, I should say startups, and how we teach the concepts there. Because once upon a time, it was viewed as though, a startup, a venture firm was nothing more than just a small version of a large corporation, a great business plan, a great idea, and off you go. You get lots of money, and we see what happens there. But really, that really has kind of changed how we look at this now. Now it's more about having a business model. It's about having an idea that you can validate in the marketplace. Do you have demand creation, things of that nature? So this event I want to touch upon that as well, although it hits Ireland too. Really, it's kind of reshaped how we kind of look at entrepreneurial innovation systems, how we look at those firms, how we teach this stuff in the curriculum here. Okay. All right. So now we move into the crisis, right? So we've really gone through the rise of the Celtic Tiger. Now we kind of hit the fall, so to speak. All right. Well, as I was talked about there, joining the EU and adopting the euro. And then in the cheap capital, it was a capital bonanza. Money is, cheap capital, lending all over the place, right? And really and again, now that it's really becoming a more global economy, right? So you now have national and transnational phenomenon here going on. So what do we mean by that? Well, a lot of borrowing going on within the country. Think about the personal spending I was talking about there going on there. You now have Ireland not only borrowing, but also lending to other countries in Europe, right? And if anyone recalls the global crisis there, Greece, right? They darn near killed the European economy there because they're such a poor nation. When they entered into the EU, Eurozone, they borrowed all that money, and they needed hundreds of billions of euros to kind of get bailed out there. So, why does this kind of matter there? Because now the tipping point, of course, at home here, we're seeing our own subprime mortgage issues happening, right? And then when Sachs, right, when those first firms kind of went under here, that became kind of a tipping point for Ireland because of this interbank liquidity dried up, right? And what that is so the interbank system, it's a global financial system in which these large banks can essentially short-term borrowing from each other because very few banks want to really keep the money in reserves, keep it on hand, right? They want to continually reinvest. So you've got this interbank market there where then as you need to cover something, you can get short-term loans from each other. Well, when the U.S. market started to collapse there, obviously, again, the global markets there, right? The reliance upon global markets there, that now hurts their banking system, okay? So these are the things that are kind of going on there. So capital finance, right? All right. So, and it's well publicized, but unemployment rates were double digits, right? The economy was crushed there. Ireland was in the news every day, along with Greece, a few European markets there. Would Europe make it? Would the euro make it? What are the effects on the U.S.? Things of that nature. So crisis and recovery here. So here we are about a year or so into the crisis there, and 4 banks, right, including these 2 big ones, became nationalized. And we saw some of these things here in the U.S. as well, right? So it's a financial crisis there, but it was, again, for some slightly different reasons. It wasn't about subprime like it was here. It was really more on the on more of the industrial markets, the lending there, okay? And they themselves needed a substantial loan, right? The International Monetary Fund, IMF, right? Kind of a lender of last resort, so to speak. And then you have the EU, right? Because the EU has the European Central Bank, right? So they provided Ireland with significant funds, right? 67.5 billion euro, 3-year loans, right? And I believe that they ended up needing an additional like 24 billion euros after the initial loans there, because of course the economy further contracts. Because as part of these loans, they have to reduce public sector wages, reduce public sector jobs, and there were some other financial restraints that the country had to kind of put in place. So these things that they had to do, these austerity measures to basically receive these loans, caused their economy to further contract a little bit, right? So they needed some additional liquidity injected in to kind of keep them afloat. But at least in the case of Ireland here, the banks returned to profitability, right? Within a couple of years, 2013 to 14. Other countries in Europe would take much longer to get there. So it was a heartfelt pain, right? But they returned to profitability. So now moving more towards present day. So there's this term, leprechaun economics. So as the country, right, kind of rebounded, they actually posted GDP growth of 25 to 35%. Now, if we recall from our courses, right, Econ IB, that is, I mean, you don't see double digits, right? And this gets back to what I said before about GDP versus GNI, right? There were some U.S. tech companies doing significant investment and some, we could say, creative accounting, right, that therefore made, because of what they're essentially using Ireland as a tax haven, things of that nature, right, that then made their GDP on a global scale just look phenomenal. So Paul Krugman, he was an economist out of the UK there, one of the, I guess you could say, grandfathers of international business, academics there, kind of dubbed this leprechaun economics, right? Basically kind of saying it's, how could a country of 5 million inhabitants, right, to start the economics of Europe that much, right, when they got 340 million people, right? Again, so it was actually kind of a shot, so to speak, at U.S. multinationals and some of the ways that we were utilizing those markets for financial. Okay, but with that said, right? So the company, so we saw the rise, you saw some of the factors there, you saw the the fall, in from that 2008 period for about 5 or 6 years, and then of course, here they are. So they have continued to remain in a global leader in tech. You got all these companies, and now we have the more modern day that we think about, right? And you've got the social companies, you've got Salesforce, Amazon, all the, and there's more. That's just a few, just to kind of give you an idea. All the big tech companies are headquartering, and they were already, but they're shifting more, all their European headquarters into, from Europe into Ireland, right? And kind of why is that? Well, perhaps we've heard about this thing called Brexit. I know I've talked about it in various international business courses that I've been in, right? That's Britain choosing the referendum in 2016 to say, we no longer wish to be part of the European Union, right? They created their own little trade deal, but we no longer want to be part of that, right? And prior to that point, many U.S. companies had headquarters in London, right? UK. Well, that caused U.S. companies to start to rethink their strategies a little bit. Not that anyone has left the UK, but maybe they're not using UK as the European headquarters because, if you remember what we talk about in the courses on the economic integration, right? When you can be in a market, one of the markets that's part of the European Union, you now have kind of free access to the entire market there. You're not paying the tariffs and dealing with all those various trade barriers that we talk about. So when UK decided to change its relationship with the rest of Europe there, that provided Ireland an opportunity to rise to the top. Now think back to when I mentioned how they created that financial center, right? Ireland was already laying the tracks to become a global leader in finance. Now London has been one of the top 2 or 3 markets in global finance, over hundreds of years. And Ireland is nowhere near there yet, Dublin specifically, but they're getting into the top 20 now. So they're creating additional opportunities, right? And don't let it be lost on us that it's the other naturally English-speaking country over in Europe, right? So think about the ease of us doing business in that particular market there. So yeah, so they're still doubling down. You get all these tech companies, all the European headquarters going, in there. You have some financial companies starting to shift some of their operations into that market there, and they've really kind of picked up definitely a wave of success as a result of the Brexit policy. Now, I put a couple things up here with these different startup things. So, I mentioned that previously Ireland had failed to, not they failed per se, we'll talk about that in just a second there, to develop kind of a national innovation system, right? Well, now they're doing those things, right? So they've got this high potential startup. That's just one. That's a government kind of run-led initiative, so to speak, agency that's there to help kind of startup, help inject funds into them, help them kind of get growing, if you will. They've got this startup entrepreneur program. STEP. This is actually about for immigrants, right? To attract bright young immigrants into the country there to help them with the funding and the resources they need to get their startups. So therefore, these immigrants from other parts of Europe and other parts of the world will want to go and start their business there because they recognize a small company that does well there, that's economic growth, right? It's 1 or 2 people when it starts, but it could be 4,000 5 years later if it does really well, right? And then they created their own area. They call this the Silicon Docks. You could liken it to, if you're familiar with Silicon Valley in the U.S., it's a portion, it's a multi-city block area in Dublin that is, and again, government-started, government-backed, if you will, to promote the entrepreneurial innovation ecosystems. So some of the critiques, if you will, that, well, they weren't really building the right foundation. It was just all about low tax rates, things of that nature. Some of those things are kind of evolving. They're creating those backbone systems, those institutional systems within the country there for sustained growth, right? And there's other things going on, but so these are just some of the things there. So, the country is kind of flying again, right? All right, so we looked at this graph early on, right? And we kind of went through the rise and the fall there. And since the recovery period, right, when the banks kind of got back to health there, we can see very significant growth. We're back, right? And then forecast, right? So with everything going on in the country, right, it's still projected to remain one of the strongest economies in Europe. So So it's really, so when you think about this, we think about modern day kind of Ireland, if you've been there or seen anything about it, seen the growth, what have you, but it's really a story of really kind of a one-time underdeveloped, developing economy that's trying to, become a fully developed economy like the U.S., like the U.K., any of those particular markets there, right? So, there's always steps, and there's ebbs and flows to it. There's peaks and valleys. One market that's been more prevalent probably in recent history is the economic growth of China, right? That economy was red hot, but they had some underlying infrastructure issues that they had to deal with there, so therefore they hit times of, where the economy wasn't quite as strong. You address those, and then you move on. So it's kind of a natural evolution of economies to kind of get from that underdeveloped place to more of that developed market space there. It doesn't happen overnight, right? So they put through a lot of the fiscal, economic policies. They kind of changed, right, their general economic policy to be more market-based, more market-oriented, right? They adjusted some of their fiscal policy with the tax rates there. They decided we're going to be more outward-oriented, globally oriented to attract, right, that foreign investment. And the other piece that I also could have mentioned there is that as these markets, and Ireland is experiencing that now definitely, as they have these U.S. tech firms, high tech, right? That's knowledge. That's the knowledge economy. As they're there and they spend a couple decades there, there's this phenomenon that we talk about in our research of the spillover effect, right? Which is eventually, because if you're employing 15% of the people there, they're going to develop those knowledges and skills over time, and then they're going to go, okay, I'm going to start up my own company. In some complementary area, maybe they're providing inputs now to the big companies, right? And those companies grow, right? It's this kind of knowledge spillover effect there. And that's what's happening in other, so more the current modern day emerging economies that maybe we talk about some of our international business or econ courses. So it's really kind of a similar story kind of from that perspective. All right, so now I'll close with, oops. Can't get it. There we go. So I'll close with, because we're getting close to our time here, the Celtic Tiger, right? Perhaps when you saw that, you kind of asked, you're wondering why, what was that name, Celtic Tiger? Where'd that come from? So if you go back to like the 70s, 1970s-ish time frame, Asia, you saw some markets there, right? So you had Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and it's escaping me. Yeah, that's it. So they were called the four Asian tigers. So they went through rapid industrialization, rapid growth, similar to, but it was more in manufacturing, not necessarily in the same industries, but they saw a rapid growth themselves there. And they were kind of like these Asian miracles, the four dragons, the four tigers there. So therefore, as Ireland kind of experienced this kind of economic miracle, they were just kind of given that similar moniker, the tiger. So dubbed kind of the Celtic Tiger there. So that's kind of where the name, the Celtic Tiger, that's kind of where that came from. So, so actually in some of my prior research, I've actually 10 years ago actually did on more in Asia, right? Because I actually do research on these emerging, developing economies, and really more from the firm perspective, how these firms, the businesses in these markets, how they develop these skills, these capabilities, right? From those inward flows of FDI from the U.S., Western European companies, those spillover kind of effects, right? The knowledge transfers, if you will, kind of how that happens there. And that's so when I was really kind of looking into this, as I agreed with Dr. Stebbins to talk about the Irish economy, kind of its rise there, I saw a lot of similarities from just the research I've done in the last 10 years on some of the more Asian emerging economies. So it's really kind of a similar story. It may look a little different, but the underlying pieces of that story are very, very similar. So that's what I have. Last thing I want to plug, since as Dr. Stebbins mentioned, if interested to learn more about Ireland or just to kind of get abroad, I will be leading a trip to Ireland in May, likely the latter part of the month there, 23rd to about into the Memorial Day weekend there. And we're going to see, we will go to the Silicon Docks. We will go to the Guinness Enterprise Center, which is also another big significant kind of innovation entrepreneurial hub. We have some opportunities to meet a couple of really cool startups getting into artificial intelligence and finance technology and things of that nature. There's a company I worked with when I took students to London a couple of years back that got us into those places, and they have the same opportunities for us in Dublin. So we could do that kind of good stuff. We'll see some wonderful sites out on the West Coast there, castles, learn about immigration, right? The whole bit. So there are some opportunities if interested. I would, feel free to come see me, ask me about it. There'll be more details probably coming in November when all the trips are kind of approved, so to speak, with budgets and all that kind of good stuff. So with that said, any questions I would be happy to take. Yes, sir.
Did Brexit affect Northern Ireland since it was so close? Did it suffer, or was the situation with Southern Ireland positive?
I'll be honest, I haven't looked into Northern Ireland per se, but obviously Northern Ireland is more economically tied on kind of the UK side there. It's really, 'cause it's part of, really UK there. So they had so some of the similar effects on the UK side. Likely. Any general questions? All right, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Stebbins to close it out then.
Well, let's get a couple more questions. 'Cause we've got 5 minutes or so. So I know Guinness is an Irish company.
Yeah.
But it's one that Americans are quite familiar with. Were they impacted at all by the crash of the Irish economy in 2008, 2009?
Is Guinness the company impacted?
Yeah.
I honestly do not have any knowledge of that. I would guess that the economy would force people to want to drink more Guinness. I know
So
it did for me.
It increased their sales, and
Exactly.
perhaps,
I think
yeah.
in my household it increased. The down economy here definitely increased the Guinness sales in my household.
Yeah.
So, but I didn't look at the company specifically. Sorry.
Has tourism also grown the same way?
Yes. Yeah.
And,
So
and they fed
so
each
yeah.
other.
Exactly. So tourism, obviously, so technology was really the boom, the impetus of their economic growth, but of course tourism kind of followed that as well. And then tourism, so if tourism follows a similar graph there, it saw that same growth period, of course saw the dip post-recession, and then grew back again. Yes, they've definitely seen a significant boom in tourism. Mm-hmm. Sure, yell it out.
So what happens to a country if they can't recover their economy? What happens if they just keep getting worse and worse and worse and they can't recover at all? I don't know. I can't understand how, if they can't recover their economy and it's so bad and inflation increases, nobody's employed, what happens to the country as a whole? No one's, you know what I mean? I don't want to explain that.
So there have been economies that have basically forfeited their currency. You're talking about inflationary factors, things of that nature, right? So there are economies in kind of Central and Latin American that have essentially dollarized their economy, like Ecuador. They simply just use the U.S. dollar, right? They could the Sucre. They could not figure out their own monetary policy, fiscal policy. So they said, we submit. We're going to follow the U.S. policy. We're going to basically use the U.S. dollar, and they're really then, and because obviously it's because of obviously some economic interdependence between the markets there. So you'll see some of those cases in other parts of the world as well, where they have basically surrendered their I guess you could say fiscal, financial kind of policies in that way. And again, I call it dollarized because there's been a few in the Latin regions that have done that. Does that help a little bit? Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
I guess finally I'm kind of struck by how Dublin has become such an emerging city, to almost rival London, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any, I know your study abroad trip is going to be focused around Dublin.
Yes.
Are you going to venture outside of Dublin much? You showed a picture of a couple of castles.
Yes. So, Blarney, right? We'll take a day trip down. That's the southern part of the country there. So the Blarney Stone, all that good stuff there. So that'll be a day trip. Likely to be a very long day, but a very fun day. Then we'll go out to Galway, on the western, see some of the scenic views of the country there. Get to the Cliffs of Moher, some of those. So we'll likely be based in Dublin for most of the trip there, but we will spend a couple days out on the west coast as well. That's for some of the scenic views. So there will be a mix of business, Scenery, history, culture, all that will be mixed in a nice 12-day package.
Okay, let's give Dr. Buccieri a final round of applause for an excellent presentation.